Welcome to Mad Men Men, where we gather in the creative lounge to discuss and analyze each and every episode of the AMC series Mad Men, which aired between 2007 and 2015. One of us is a first-time watcher of the show. One of us went through it just once back when it was airing, and then there's me, who I don't know how I'm able to do this after Warhol. I'm John Negroni, and well, Ashton, I see you've handed me a typed-up letter. Let's see. Dear John, I wanted you to know I'm very sorry. Right now, my life is very strange. That's all it says.
Hey, John. Quick question. Did you get the peaches?
Peaches?
Yeah, did you get the peaches? Pears? Oh,
we'll talk about it.
It is pears.
Yeah, you're supposed to say pears. You messed it up.
What I was going to do is at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the episode, I was going to ask you, did you get the pears? But since I messed it up, I'm not going to do that. Sorry.
That's the kind of thing you got to prep with me beforehand. But I guess we can discuss it later with when Mike's not around. And Mike Overhulse, I just have one thing to say to you. Your podcast is not my podcast.
Hey, John, did you get the peaches?
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Mad Men Men.
I thought that would get a laugh.
I thought that was pretty good.
We're here to talk about The Rejected, not any peaches or pears. The first episode directed by John Slattery, who plays Roger on the show. The first episode of anything he's ever directed, as he has pointed out. This is the fourth episode of season 4, so we got a 4-4. And this episode was written by Keith Huff and Matthew Weiner. I don't remember ever seeing Keith Huff before in the show. This might be his first time, unless I missed it. But there you go. So we're still in the first half of season 4. In terms of ratings, this is a bit of a dip compared to the first 3 episodes, which were already declining a little bit each time, but this is a bigger decline than the last 2.
You said it's a dip. Is it chip and dip?
Yeah, like chipped a little bit in the last episode, and now it's in the dip. But fortunately, we have 2. But yeah, so this episode is definitely an interesting one. Some big things happen in this. Will, you're our first time watcher. What was your initial impression of everything that happened in this? What's your theory on what this episode's about?
Well, I guess since you asked 2 questions, to answer your first question, I will say I really liked this episode. I thought, we've talked about, I think already with season 4, there's been a progression to make it a little bit more cinematic. I think a little bit less overstated. Like there's a desire here for this episode to be, even though it's about people kind of confronting each other or confronting their own insecurities or shortcomings or what have you. This episode, as far as Slattery's direction goes, I think is pretty understated and graceful. And I was really impressed to know that this was his first time directing anything, because it feels very assured and competent. And it feels maybe more cinematic than some of the recent episodes we've gotten, which is to say something, because I feel like this season's has been making great strides to be, visually a little bit more assured and bold and experimental in some respects. But yeah, like I said, I feel like the big takeaway of this episode is it's another sort of Peggy Pete thing where there are these 2 kids of the office who are kind of gradually growing up as Don kind of withers down and kind of gets caught up in his own insecurities that come with maturity, as it were. But no, I think there is something to be said about Pete settling down. He's, becoming a family man once more, in the sense that he's actually going to have a child with Trudy. And it looks like Peggy is going to be coming into a more bohemian sort of thing. Like, she's already taking great strides to be a little bit more socially progressive. She's progressive in the sense that, like, she's the first woman copywriter in the Sterling Cooper office now. Sterling Cooper Draper Lane. Is that right? Did I get it right?
Lane is his first name. Okay. So Sterling Cooper
Draper. That's right.
Price,
yes.
SCPD.
All right. 3 for 4. What can you do?
SCDP.
Yeah. But no, it kind of just shows that they're in sync with one another, but they're also kind of taking different steps forwards. And I think that's really communicated beautifully in that scene with the elevator and the glass doors, where they're, kind of making eye contact, but kind of going their different ways. And yeah, I think it's a really lovely episode. Obviously, there's a little bit more going on as well with Dawn, as per usual. But yeah, that was my big takeaway. I found myself really impressed by this episode.
Yeah, I like this episode too. And I think that what you mentioned about Peggy and Pete there, one thing that Weiner kind of talked about in writing the episode is he mentions how for Pete, you kind of see him with the adults. You kind of mentioned the growing up part of it. And there's a couple moments in the episode, like when Harry mentions they're coming up, he and Ken kind of bond over reaching this like next level of their lives, right? Ken being engaged or married at this point, I think just engaged, and Pete having a baby. But then Peggy, kind of conversely, she's like growing up in a different way where it's more like she's enjoying her youth. She's hanging out with like the cool kids and kind of taking advantage of her youth in a different way, but still kind of progressing, which there's an interesting contrast there. Mike Overholtz, I know you are a big Roger fan. What did you think of this episode? Do you think Slattery's got some skill behind the camera?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of, and by a lot, I mean all the projects he's directed, like for film. So I feel like I got a good idea of his chops, and yeah, always impressive. But in terms of the episode, I think this is one of those episodes that it only gets better when you watch it for like a second, third time. I think honestly more than, and maybe it's just because we are, spoiler alert, on a bit of a break, and I haven't watched the show as much in recent weeks. Coming back to it and watching this one, I was kind of struck about like how much is in this episode, like the seeds of so many things that are to come. And it kind of blew me away. Part of it, John, is what you're saying with, showing the different routes you can take in your career with, you've seen Don, in his life, where he was like popular, and then he's now having all these family issues. But now you're starting to see those junior employees that he used to just not really care about start to go on the path he was on with their families. And then I really do love what they're doing as a juxtaposition with Peggy in, the more beatnik, bohemian, enjoying her youth. But also, like, you do see, I mean, I think a little bit of sadness and regret in it. So it's all just fun to watch the different paths that we can take in life.
Yeah. Another thing, that I do really want to bring up here is something that Weiner was stressing a lot, which is another big aspect, a big theme of this episode is embarrassment, specifically with the Dawn storyline. So we see how Dawn kind of reacts to being embarrassed and humiliated, honestly. We've talked before about how he punishes himself for the divorce, and we kind of see him almost like, I think the happiest we see him in this episode is when he gets the bad secretary, Miss Blankenship, although a legend technically. But when he's talking to Roger about it, you kind of see that it's almost giving him a little bit of relief, because even in that moment where like his dirty laundry, this secret with Allison, basically the whole office knows now that he slept with her and it turned into this big thing. But the fact that he gets like some kind of punishment, it's almost like, I almost see like a little bit of relief on his face of like, yeah, you know what, I deserve this. And it's like it makes him feel better, honestly.
I could see it. I mean, I do think it is kind of telling at this point that maybe more so than any episode we've seen of late, Dawn is primarily seen in the office. Like, we don't really get to see a lot of his personal life this time around. Like,
he
with the
stays
exception
drinking.
of that scene.
Yeah.
Right.
And like, it's like super nighttime. It's like, there's this cool shot of him like with the city in the backdrop. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So like the idea of like his home work life is not only being intertwined, but like he doesn't really have much of a life at all at this point, because he's kind of just coasting as far as work goes. And then his home life is almost non-existent. And there, you see that kind of remorse and fear in his eye as he's, watching those elderly couples do their very sad, but also kind of darkly funny grocery shopping tour at the end of the episode. Yeah. I mean, I do like seeing Don get his comeuppance, at least in a very small sort of way, but there is also an undeniable sense that for as much as this guy is a son of a gun and ne'er-do-well, you do feel some sort of pity and remorse for him, however unearned that may or may not be.
Yeah, but, when Tom is like, you son of a bitch, he's really talking about Don because he's watching the show.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. He's been keeping pace. I do want to say real quick to Mike, did you see Maggie Moore's? Or Moore, or however you pronounce it? Okay. I did watch, I did want to say, because I seen it like 10 years prior. I rewatched God's Pocket, Slattery's film, prior to this, because I was curious, knowing a little bit more about him as an actor, if I would like that movie a little bit more now, because I remember I was really excited for it at the time, and I was kind of disappointed. I felt it was just okay at the time, and I was curious to hear what you thought of the film, Mike, if you remember your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I didn't really think that it was that great of a film itself, but I really enjoyed. I don't know. Maybe it's just that was the novelty of like, oh man, it's Slattery. But
Hmm.
Maggie Moore's, I did enjoy, and
Okay.
I thought, yeah,
Because I do want to watch that one after we watch the Slattery Mad Men episodes, just to kind of get the full cycle. But rewatching God's Pocket, I gotta say, I think I appreciate it a little bit more now, but I do find myself kind of wishing it was a little bit more than what it is. So I was curious how his more recent directorial work was in comparison.
well, you can come on to my new podcast, God's Pod Kit,
Yeah.
where we
Nice.
talk all things John Slattery.
I do want to talk about Slattery a bit more and his directing, but real quick, I do want to add one extra last little tidbit to something you mentioned, Will, about Don's home life and like not having one. There's actually this cool thing that Weiner mentions when they were writing the show originally. The ending wasn't even that moment with the elderly couple. It was actually Don coming home to the apartment and having this conversation on the phone with Sally, your nemesis. And it would have been the only time we hear Sally or get any Sally or any of that in the episode. But they kind of just changed it the last minute and felt like, no, that's not really the right way to end this. The scene with the elderly couple is based on a real thing that Lisa Albert, a longtime collaborator on the show, mentioned that she had actually seen this like couple have this kind of conversation. And Weiner's takeaway from it was that it's really Dawn just kind of seeing like these people be like, this is our business. Like even this like super minor thing about pears, like she's walking in the hallway and she's not responding to him because Dawn is there. And she's like, we'll talk about it inside. And like the takeaway that Dawn has is that, yeah, that's how it should be. Like your private life stays private. If you're embarrassed about something, it's your business, not my business. And that kind of echoes what Peggy says, right? Of like, your problem is not my problem. Right. And like it also ties into the focus group thing of like people embarrassing themselves, prostrating themselves like that. Pete kind of does that in the episode, like embarrassing himself in front of Tom. And it's really sort of ending the episode with Don being like, why would anyone want, he can't even bring himself to finish that letter because he's just so ashamed and he just cannot accept that he did something, or like he doesn't want to like relish or put a light on the thing he did wrong. He just wants to stew in it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do imagine if there was a scene that was taken out or deleted with Sally, it involved Don after he was at the typewriter calling up Sally, being like, hey, I don't really know how to put this, but there's this girl, Allison, and you hear on the other end, Sally like, say no more. And then you just see her menacingly cocking a gun, hanging up the phone.
Yeah. Glenn brandishes his knife.
Right.
But yeah, Slattery, I'm glad. I'm glad that we get to talk about Slattery finally as the director. I know we talked about how he shadowed Phil Abraham on a few episodes before this, and he kind of has talked about how he didn't expect to do an episode this early. He was like, I thought I might do a season or do an episode like next season, but he was surprised when Weiner kind of gave him this assignment. And he kind of mentions how when he directed this episode, he had a hard time directing himself. He's not in this episode that much. And he said he had a hard time because he couldn't remember his lines, specifically in that opening scene. And I'm curious because you two have watched more of his other directing stuff. That's like a habit of his, right? That he doesn't really direct himself.
Yeah, I mean, he's not in God's Pocket. I can't speak for Maggie Moore's. I was going to say, this is the first time that I can recall that any of the on-screen talent for Mad Men was doing double duty, right? I know eventually John Hamm directs an episode, or maybe a couple episodes, but this is the first time any of the actors directed on the show, right?
I'll double check, but I think you might be right. In the meantime, while I check that, I think, has Matthew Weiner showed up in the show at all yet? Has he had a cameo? Probably not, huh?
Maybe. I forget. I know he's on I know he makes cameos in The Sopranos. I forget if he makes any cameos in Mad Men.
Right. I want to say no, but I don't think he has. But yeah, I just went through all the directors and no, nobody's. I think maybe writers. I'll double check on that. I know like Cater Gordon, for example, showed up in one episode as a cameo, but we might have had co-writers also be talent. I'll double check that.
Just Weiner's kid. But yeah, also just for the record, he's not in Maggie Moore's.
Okay, yeah, that's what I figured. I was
I wasn't 100% sure because I know he's in Confess Fletch, right?
He is in Confess Fletch, but he also did not. He didn't direct Confess Fletch,
right? Either. But they came out around the same time, so I was kind of conflating two because I haven't seen either film yet. So, all right, thanks for clarifying.
I also definitely have seen both movies, but also was conflating the two. So I literally just Googled it to make sure I was right.
But yeah, Mike, what was your take on Slattery's directing in this episode? Especially since you were kind of familiar with him, like, what do you think is his style that he kind of brings to the show? That's something I've been trying to figure out. Of like, okay, what makes a Slattery thing?
Yeah, here's the thing is until Maggie Moore's, I really didn't feel like there was any particular like Slattery move. Like I did think that watching God's Pocket, and I definitely thought that watching this of like this was a man who's excited about directing, but just wanting to make a quality product. And I think he had to get a couple under his belt before he was like, all right, now I'm actually like I feel comfortable with what I know I can do. So now let's start taking not exactly risks, but trying new things. Because I do think that this is a well directed episode in the sense of like yeah, it is. I would say middle of the line directing. You know what I mean? Like I think about the shots with Pete and Tom. I think are done well. Like it could be way worse with that setup and the back and forth. I think about Peggy and like the phone call or like her friends or when Megan doesn't really like her. And so all these scenes kind of stand out as being well done, but I don't think particularly like, wow, Slattery's got the gift.
I gotta disagree. I think. I mean, I'm going to echo some of the things that Matt Zolerslice said in his chapter in this episode, but I do think now that I'm more familiar with Slattery as an actor, like I can see the like kind of like sly, confident, like dry sense of humor kind of echo into his directorial style in a way that like I'm not going to say it's like super pronounced or that it's like I if I were to watch this knowing like if this was a Slattery episode or not, I can't say like it's like completely apparent, but I just see like the little grace notes. Like there's the scene where after Allison storms out and throws the ashtray, like you see Dawn fixing
one take, by the way.
Oh yeah,
she nailed it on the first take. Incredible.
There's this shot where like Dawn's fixing a drink, and then just slyly in the background you see Peggy like poking her head out to kind of figure out what's going on, but she's like too mousy to like, you know, go into the office and ask Dawn. And like, there's like these little like dry, like subtle notes, I think throughout that, I don't know, just seem very similar to how he is as an actor. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say, you know, he's like out of the gate, like one of the best directors we got, but you know, I think it's a nice job. I mean, I'm definitely impressed that it's his first time directing, to be sure.
I think what impresses me, since you brought it up, especially the whole thing with like Peggy popping your head up, is actually a good example of like when you know the behind the scenes that wasn't originally like totally in the script. They were kind of scrappy about the whole scene with like her head popping up, but then also showing her receiving the phone call. Originally, you don't see her head at all. So there are moments where in this episode where you can be like, oh, this is clearly like Roger is listening to the writers. John Slattery is listening to, you know, he's kind of, you know, bending the knee, if you will, to Weiner and Huff in terms of, you know, the intention of the show and the creative direction of it, as well as Chris Manley, the DP, and how he wants to shoot things. Slattery has said, like, you know, or I think it was Weiner who said that, like, yeah, the mark of a great Mad Men director is when they listen to Chris Manley. But he was also very scrappy with certain moments in the episode and like what to improvise and what to like make up. The big party scene, for example, they kind of had to come up with some like unique ways to make all that stuff really work and be economical, right? So to me, it just seems like more than anything, he's not just a solid director here. I think he's just a really good collaborator. Like, I think he just gets on with people, and when they run into problems, he's just really good at solving them with a good crew.
Yeah, I mean, it does help that he like knows all these actors and stuff. Like he's
exactly.
Not like, yeah,
exactly.
It's the comfortability, like, right, and he's in it too, so he comes with that experience.
I do think it is, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but like the first scenes we see in the episode are Roger like on the phone. He's like literally calling the shots, as it were. And then like, you know, he goes on to direct the episodes. I don't know if that was intentional or if that's just me reading too much into it, but
I think Don will be able to help you with that, Lee. Yeah. I want to know what y'all's favorite storylines are in this episode. And for me, I think it's easily Pete and Peggy's kind of dynamic. For example, I love something I didn't notice until I think my second rewatch of this sitting, you know, so I watched the episode 3 times. And on the second time, I had never noticed before that you literally had Pete like banging his head on the column. And then later in the episode, you have Peggy doing the same thing with her desk, right? So both kind of characters, like it just kind of speaks to their connection. I love everything with both Pete and Peggy in this episode. But what about you all? Do you have a differing take? I'm going to guess, actually. I'm going to say that Mike's favorite part of the whole episode is the focus group.
It is the focus group. It is. It truly, like, I'm not even saying that just because you said it. It's pretty good.
Mike's like, I have a routine.
Well,
I'll just say it.
Fiance Hannah uses Pond's cold cream. Let me tell you, it's in our shower.
By the way, speaking of product placement, I thought it was interesting. I'd never noticed this too before either, but it's kind of interesting that like Freddie Rumsen is eating Wise potato chips instead of Utz potato chips because I'm assuming Utz isn't their client anymore. But I thought that was kind of a funny little nod.
Yeah, and I think that's like a nice subtle little sight gag too, where he's like just before that he's like, I want a Danish, and then you just see him like eating in the thing shortly thereafter. But I do want to say.
Weiner actually mentioned real quick about that they really wanted to make sure that because Weiner was worried because of how long the focus group scene is that people wouldn't be as interested. So he tried to use Freddie Rumsen like dialogue to kind of like keep it fun and engaging. Yeah.
I do gotta say, as far as product placement goes, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this is the first time ever in a Mad Men episode that they drop Mountain Dew, which apparently are nudes. Yeah. I mean, so it does feel like they kind of. I don't know if it's just because of like AMC giving them a little bit more carte blanche or whatever, but like you see some boobies in this episode, you know, like how'd that
pass? Content warning they had to clear for it. Okay. And part of the reason they were able to get away with it is because they're actual 60-year-old nudes, at 60-year-old at the time. And so they were able to pass it off as like, you know, art.
Historically important. Kind of stuff.
So there were 3 photos. They got away with 2 of them. Yeah. I think they had a compromise or something.
And that's what I told HR when they found those photos on my laptop.
It's not nudes, it's art.
Haven't you ever been to DC? Yeah.
Yeah.
They have tentacles for a reason.
Man. But no, I mean, I was glad to see Mountain Dew got a name drop. I did not realize that Mountain Dew was around in the 60s.
Yeah, I think it was pretty new at the time. And yeah, we not only is Mountain Dew show up in this episode, but our old buddy Ken Cosgrove,
who is the head of Mountain Dew or accounts of Mountain Dew or something like that with Pepsi.
Head of he's not, I don't think he's head of accounts, but I think he's the account man for that. And we get a little bit of an update on what he's been up to. Things didn't work out at McCann. There's a funny little trivia tidbit where Weiner said that McCann kind of brags about being on the show, even though the show says that they're the worst agency in the world, but they kind of take pride in it anyway, which I think is funny in class. But yeah, Ken Cosgrove. Will, did you expect we'd see him again so soon?
If anything, I was kind of surprised how long it took to bring him back. I figured they would at least check in with him sooner, but maybe that's just because we've been spacing out these episodes so long that feels longer than it really was. I guess it was because it's only been like 4 episodes or something. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it made sense to me. You know, it's good to check in on him. I was initially more sympathetic of Ken coming back, especially because, you know, Harry is just kind of barging himself into Pete's office and talking about how Ken is in charge of Mountain Dew. And I'm like, all right, maybe I'm going to turn a corner. Maybe I'm going to like fully hate Harry and go on to Ken. But then Ken had to like, you know, be all non-PC and drop the R word on us. It's like, where is this coming from, Ken? I thought, you know,
it is the 1960s. You know, it's kind of.
I know.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, I'm sorry. Like, literally, the show starts with, like, the very first episode is a man being like, "Is this black guy bothering you?"
I know.
I'm sorry.
I know.
This is where you draw the line.
I am being tongue firmly on cheek here, but yeah, no. I overall though, I was happy to see Ken back, and I have a feeling this isn't the last we're gonna see of old Kenny boy.
Now, I have bad news for you, Will Ashton, but in the commentaries, Slattery also drops the R word because he repeats that line. Really? Oh. Yeah. So even in like 2010, I think that word was still, you know, used quite. Well, you know, it was not.
I feel like in 2010, it's firmly in the vocabulary of many Americans.
I feel like by 2010, it was getting out of fashion.
It was on the way out. Yeah.
But I do know, like in the 2000s, like in the early to like mid 2000s, it was like having I don't know if I want to call it a resurgence, but it was maybe it was just because I was in middle school. I remember hearing a lot of people drop the R word and stuff
Yeah, I
a
think
bunch
that was
around
just
that
middle
time.
school. Well,
Yeah.
But also, The Office, I think, had a big joke about it, right? Of how, like, you can't say that word, but then they say it. And then, yeah, I mean, edgy TV, or what was considered edgy at the time. But yeah,
30 Rock.
Will, we never said what your favorite storyline is. So far, we've got the focus group. We've got the, Pete and Peggy. But is there something else, or one of those? What do you think?
I gotta go with Peggy. It's just cool to see Lifetime magazine and Zasha Mamet. Not
Life
too long
magazine.
before. Sorry,
It's not
Life magazine.
Lifetime magazine.
Sorry.
Come on now.
Yeah, Life magazine. It was nice to see Zasha Mamet shortly before Girls. I believe this would be like 2 or 3 years before. I think.
Vincent Kartheiser, and he kind of mentions that he had just seen The Kids Are All Right. So that was like, I think he said his first time seeing her. Yeah. And he's like, she was definitely not a lesbian in that movie.
But no, I think she does a nice job. I mean, a totally different role than Shoshana, to be sure. And, I think it's so fun to hang out with like the more bohemian side of the 60s. I feel like, we've seen little bits and pieces of it, certainly with Dawn's excursions in LA and abroad. But yeah, I mean, just kind of nice to see that side of culture and like, the awareness of like Andy Warhol and whatnot, I think is, like a nice change of pace. And I think in that scene too, like I was saying before, you kind of see Slattery's sly sense of humor kind of coming in a little bit more, and like the, like sort of like tongue in cheek sense of humor there, but it's not overladen. I think it's pretty gracefully handled in a way that I think other writers or directors would have made it a little bit clunkier, a little bit more obvious. I think they're pretty good about that. No, I think that was probably my favorite stuff, was just, and I'm always just happy to see Peggy progressing in the world, like, and seeing her kind of developing more and more of a backbone, I think too, even though I can't vouch for her, cutting Allison down the size, but if I can let,
or cheating on her boyfriend,
sure. But I guess if I can forgive Ken for dropping the R word, I suppose I can forgive Peggy for her transgressions as well.
Yeah, Zasha Mamet is in the show here, and I think that one thing that Weiner said about her is that she's actually based on a real person that he knew in college, who is this kind of like cool lesbian artistic person that he thought was just like super cool, always made him smile, and so he was happy to kind of find a way to bring that kind of character into the show. But also, my headcanon for this character, because like Megan at one point even says like she's kind of pretentious, and Peggy's like, yeah. But I like to think that like my headcanon for the character is like she kind of acts all bohemian, but like she probably is kind of like Zasha Mamet, and that her dad is probably really famous. You know what I mean? And it's all kind of part of like, I'm really cool, but okay, like maybe she's like a Nepo kid or something, which isn't canon or anything, but I like to think that way.
Sure. Very, very brief transgression since we brought up Zasha Mamet. Did you guys hear David Mamet's making a Hunter Biden movie?
Man. How the turntables, right?
Yeah. It's just fun to think about like Zasha Mamet and like David Mamet like getting together for lunch or something, and then like, Zasha Mamet's talking about all these cool kind of liberal art projects, and David Mamet just like, I'm writing the Hunter Biden movie.
He's like, have you heard about this laptop?
Right, yeah, exactly.
He's like, I saw this huge dong at one point, and but yeah, what was your take on the Bohemian stuff, Mike? Was it up there for you as well, or do you have an unpopular opinion?
I mean, that's a good question. I would say maybe unpopular. Like, I enjoy its placement, like in the show. Obviously, like, it has to be there, but I'm always questioning like the show's treatment of that like kind of way of life, because I don't think it portrays them in a very like serious light. You know what I mean? And maybe that's just because most of what we're seeing is kind of like through Don's eyes, or mostly like those people from those walks of life. And so generally, they also didn't really have a lot of respect for like the people of those lifestyles and more artistic types of people. But yeah, I just don't think they're not caricatures, but they definitely lean closer to that than they do of like characters of substance. Am I off base here?
No, and I think I'm glad you bring up caricatures, because there's another moment that kind of underlines that too, where Peggy tries to bring up like, did you know that Malcolm X got shot last week? And it's another testament to the era in terms of when we look back on history, right? We have our own sense of like the stuff that was important, the stuff that mattered. But to them at that time, that wasn't even front page news. Like Weiner even mentioned that. And it's one of those things where hindsight is one thing, where we can kind of look at the Bohemian characters, like those are baby boomers, right? And it's such a they went on to kind of define the decade, the 60s and counterculture and stuff. But we know them now kind of as, well, I guess they're the older baby boomers. Cause like right now you have like more of like the Sally Draper baby boomers, like more toward that end. I don't know if I have my generations right, actually. Actually, you know what? I might be kind of messing up there because I think they might be the in-between generation, the one that was like right after the greatest. And it kind of includes like Don, but then it's like the Pete Campbells and the Peggies. Actually, I might be messing that up. I think baby boomers. Because they had to be baby boomers, right? Because they were born right after World War II.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I got that right. I don't know. Close enough.
Awesome analysis there.
Yeah. Really, really sure-footed.
Yeah.
What do you
Congratulations,
think,
John.
Why do you think the episode is called The Rejected?
I mean, obviously that's an allusion to the photographer having his tasteful nudes being rejected, but also, I mean, Dawn's being rejected by Allison.
He's rejecting Allison. He won't even write her the thing.
But I think he's rejecting her because he got rejected, in the sense that, like, it's one of those times where, I mean, there is something cathartic about Dawn kind of getting, like we said, his comeuppance, but it's one of the rare times where, like, he has no real control over the situation and, like, has kind of his wayward ways kind of thrown back at him, in this case, quite literally. And, the fact that he was just so, blasé about his feelings, his interactions with Allison, and now he's getting his, like, some sense of repercussions for it. In some ways, I feel like it does make him feel maybe a little bit more alive, but also seems to be inspiring maybe some sort of self-pity as well. And yeah, he is, I don't know, he's not in a great place right now. It seems like, I don't know, I mean, for as much as Pete has tried to emulate Dawn, this is like the first time I can think of where he really seems to be closer to Dawn than Pete in his own way, like in the sense, like when he confronts his father-in-law, like that seems like something that Dawn would do more likely than like what Pete that we've known for the past 3 seasons would do in that such way.
I think like the way he reconciles with Ken is kind of a Draper move of like knowing your enemy, but then, it kind of inspires him, right? Like the thing that Ken says about how he just has all the little pieces. I think that's what kind of puts a fire in Pete to be like a little competitively again, because he hasn't had a competitor like Ken around him, but it's almost like Ken kind of makes him better. You do want to see them kiss, but since they're not going to, you can just kind of see Pete sort of at that point. You're like, you know what? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to try to get all of Vic's chemical, not just Clearasil. And that is a kind of like you're right, a Draper thing. Although I gotta say, one thing I think I disagree with, and I want to know, Mike, who you're going to side with here, but I think Don genuinely is just dumb about the Allison thing. Like, I don't think he understands how dumb he's being about the recommendation, like writing her a reference. I think he genuinely believes that that's what she prefers. He just doesn't have the emotional intelligence to understand why she's upset and why she feels like he doesn't actually care about her, because he's not willing to write in his own words what she means to him. And I don't see that as him being like embarrassed or like, well, you're not good enough or whatever. I think he's genuinely trying to be nice, but he's just bad at it.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with that. Yeah, he's just a fucking idiot.
Take that, Will. You heard it.
I'm not gonna. Go ahead, Mike.
I don't know. I was going to move on to more people who got rejected. So say what you're going to say.
Oh no, I don't reject your hypothesis here. I also just feel like maybe Don, because he's been so calculated in the past, maybe I just am giving him more credit than is due at this point.
I don't think Don's been calculated with one night stands though from weeks like prior. You know what I mean? Like this person means absolutely nothing to him.
Sure, as far as one night stands go, but like as far as his place in the workplace, I think he's a lot more calculated about his coworkers. But I think he just doesn't really view Allison as a contemporary in any particular way, and then he's just been so negligent with her feelings and her emotional well-being and whatnot. So yeah.
I also think though that that's a misconstruing. You're misconstruing. What's a construing? There's the word. I need a D in there.
There you go.
Don as at the top of a company is different than Don at Sterling Cooper. Sterling
Yes.
Cooper, he was manipulative and he was like always plotting where he was going, but he's at the fucking top now. And I truly think he doesn't care and he's showing it in more ways than one.
Yeah, because I think what I agree with about that is he's at the top, and Allison is kind of his work life, and he kind of gets emotional satisfaction from that dynamic. But ultimately, he was always trying to avoid this situation where, again, he just gets embarrassed. He doesn't want people at his work knowing what's going on with his private parts. I think he's just very, very meticulous and he gets easily sensitive about that sort of thing, and understandably so. And that actually kind of dovetails nicely into the whole thing with, Freddie having this moment. Like, as soon as Peggy leaves the focus group to go talk to Allison, that's when Freddie chooses to kind of try and gloat, right, about his strategy. That, Pond's cold cream, his strategy to Peggy earlier in the season was, oh, women just want to get married, and say that the cold cream is going to help you get married. And Don and Peggy have both been kind of in agreement that no, like that's not, that's too simplistic, or that's not art, kind of, referring back to the Holy Eucharist film and art and advertising and all that. But
Sure.
do you think Freddie's being vindicated here, or do you think Don is right when he's arguing with Faye about it later? It's like, well, you have to like put these ideas in people's heads. You can't just, only reflect people's opinions back at them.
Well, I think when Don's talking about that with Faye, it's one of those like, he doesn't have a therapist, so he's just kind of putting himself into his idea of like what he thinks is wrong with the work. And so I don't know. I guess I don't really look at it as what he is saying should be taken that seriously. I think it's just more like he just doesn't really have an outlet to work through his things necessarily. I mean, maybe he's not entirely wrong, but I don't think he's necessarily right. But at the same time, I feel like I'd be remiss if I sided with Freddie Rumsen on many things, even though I don't think he's incompetent at his job. I think he is, in the ways of women, certainly outdated in many respects. Though I do notice that probably because of how upset Peggy got when he was, being overtly and outwardly sexist, he seems to kind of reserve his more misogynistic thoughts to when Peggy leaves the room, I noticed. So I don't know if that's progression necessarily, but it's at least an awareness of Peggy's sensitivities. So I can't chalk that as a win, but it is at least an awareness of his coworkers' issues. So that is what it is.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah. We're jumping around quite a bit, which is the way to do it for sure. But I guess we could finish out if I go through some trivia and jump around from there, and we can do our thing. I really wanted to mention, because I thought this was like a cool tidbit, in the beginning of the episode when they're using that extra phone device to listen in on the conversation. That's actually called a mother-in-law, and they used it once before in the show with that prank call that they do to Peggy with her roommate, which I thought was kind of funny and makes a lot of sense, like that they would have that kind of thing back in the day. But I hadn't really noticed that before. And also, Matthew Weiner mentioned that Alexa, who plays Allison in the show, it's kind of wild to see how far she's come here, that she was hired for just one line in the first season, and they ended up doing so much with her character. But Will, what's your take? Do you think we're going to see Allison come back at any point, or do you think this is it for her on the show?
I don't want to be foolish and assume, but I would not be surprised this is the last we see of dear Allison.
I'm sorry you have to say that. And by the way, like, do you feel like we're missing out because we didn't have Sally or Bobby or any of the Betty stuff, or what?
Honestly, I didn't even really think about them until we started recording. No offense to them. It just did not cross my mind, honestly.
Another thing that I thought was interesting is Pete's reaction to finding out that Trudy's going to have a kid, because I've been confused while watching the show before of like why Trudy didn't say anything to him and like why she waited as long as she did. But it does make a lot of sense, because he has in the past been so resistant, like he didn't want to adopt a kid. He seemed pretty indifferent to having kids in general. But when he finds out, it seems like he's really into the idea. So then you can kind of be like, oh yeah, no wonder Trudy was kind of hesitant about telling him. That's my theory anyway, but did that surprise you guys too, in terms of Pete's reaction, how he's dealing with it?
No, I think you can't really expect how Pete's going to react in this situation, because he's already had one child rejected. Boom. and also like stuff with his own father. And so, who is Pete in this moment? I think how the show handles it is a great indicator, like really great characterization of, you know, who Pete is in season 4 compared to who's Pete has been prior to this. And honestly, I think for a lot of people, that is what like actually finding out you're going to be a father does. Honestly,
Mike, do you have some news for us?
Yeah, Will,
You're pregnant?
I am pregnant. God,
Nice. Congratulations.
It feels so good. It's awesome. It's one of those things. I'm actually a surrogate for a company. I'm pregnant with Vicks Chemicals.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's
I thought you were telling us that you got your uterus removed because there was like some kind of cyst on it, but cool.
That is a nice little like sly dark joke in the episode as well, where he just kind of casually just mentions this horrific thing that happened to his mother-in-law.
Yeah, White even said he's heard people do that so many times where
right.
like they suddenly get super personal out of nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if I had any real complaint about the episode is that, at least from Slattery's point, I think he's maybe a little too overt with like the acknowledgement of like, hey, Pete's had a baby before, because there's like the scene with him and Trudy, and then like you had like this like reaction shot of Pete being like, oh, I thought it would feel, or something. He says something exact to some degree of like acknowledgement of his kid before, and I just feel like it's maybe putting a little too fine of a point, and maybe it was noticeable for me because Slattery in this episode I feel is fairly graceful as a director otherwise. But yeah, I mean, I think I commend Pete for not being what's the word I'm looking for, disappointed, I guess, in having a kid. He's actually elated, and it seems like he is maturing in an actual honest way.
He's genuinely interested too, because when he's at his desk and Lane comes to him, Vincent Kartheiser said that, oh yeah, he's literally writing down like different insurance plans and numbers for kids. Like he's like super into it. And it's like, it's because he's kind of ready to move into that next stage of his life. And I think that he wasn't before. And it's almost one of those things where he didn't know he was ready.
And it's one of those things where it's kind of cheap to assume, and I definitely don't want to assume anything with Pete and Trudy, but unlike with Dawn and Betty, I could see them having a kid actually being the thing that kind of reshapes and molds their relationship together. I mean, it seems like things between Pete and Trudy in general have just been better of late.
They're very close in this episode, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe having the kid is kind of the metaphor for that in that respect, but no,
he treats Trudy completely differently from how Dawn treated Betty. Like Trudy is in his work life. Like she knows about what he's up to. She's part of it. She gives him advice. We've seen that over at least 2 seasons.
She's getting the hot work goss, as it were, about Ken.
Yeah, she definitely is. And by the way, I forgot to mention this too, but speaking of kids, remember in season 3, right, where Conrad Hilton is in Don's office and surprises him, and he kind of cuts Don down for not having pictures of like his kids and his family in his office. And he's like, I'm too busy reading the Bible, or whatever Don says. And you'll notice like in this episode, and maybe in the other episodes this season too, and I just hadn't noticed it before, but he has kids, or he has pictures of like Sally and Bobby and stuff now in his office. And it just kind of shows you he really doesn't take that stuff for granted anymore, or he's trying not to at the very least, because he lost it. And before he was trying to keep his work life and his home life completely separate. Now he doesn't have any life. So he's like, well, I care. Maybe it's also him trying to tell the world, like, I do care about my kids, even though I'm divorced. I don't see them all the time.
Mm-hmm. He's been listening to more Harry Chapin, I've noticed as well. I mean, it does feel like he's a little bit more remorseful, as it were. That's an inside joke, I guess, for the three of us. But I was hoping that would get some reaction from John and Mike, but I guess not.
Mike's a little tired. Mike's been going through it since he got pregnant. Also with the focus group stuff, I forgot to mention this too, but Weiner said before that, people do cry in these focus groups. And one of the advisors to the show, their wife does this for a living. And there's a lot of that real person built into the character of Faye. Although he did mention that she's like a bit kinder than Faye on like some level, but both of them just have this gift of like bringing like really deep emotions out of people, which is why the focus group kind of goes the way that it goes. And I also think there's something notable about what Peggy sees in Faye, especially in this episode. Like it seems like Peggy kind of looks up to Faye, kind of admires her moxie. And then at the same time, she also admires the, I
wedding
almost said
ring.
the Shoshana character, but Joyce.
Okay. Oh, you mean with the? Yeah, I thought you meant the when she's like putting on the ring as well, like kind of admiring it and kind of, imagining
Yeah.
what if. Yeah.
I think the episode makes a point that it's not like she's embracing this kind of like youth kind of in revolt sort of thing without even, thinking about like, do I settle down? I have this boyfriend who's, renting out my vagina, which is a brilliant line. But I think it's funny that she kind of like has this sort of like path that she's on, and she has a very like have her cake and eat it too, which also combines with the whole like art and advertising. Like she wants to get paid. She wants to get paid for her art. But at the same time, it is something that is kind of conflicting with, what art kind of can mean to a lot of people. So I think the Peggy stuff is just so fascinating.
And to quickly tie back to Faye, I do think it's interesting that the idea of like what makes Faye effective at her job, and as far as the focus group goes, is that like she's honest or like kind of cuts the bullshit a little bit, but like as part of it, she has to like take off her wedding ring and has to like kind of hide parts of herself to seem quote unquote more honest, and I think that's pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, and her accent, the actor Cara Buono plays Faye, and she was saying that like, I have to like adjust the way that I talk and how New York, I talk and everything like that in order to make people feel at ease. And Chris Manley actually said too that he had a job actually in college doing video for focus groups just like this. So he kind of had a moment where he's like, yeah, I know how to do this, which I think is kind of funny. Also, a fun piece of trivia is that the bar where Pete is talking to Tom is the same. It's like a real bar called Musso and Frank's, and they used the other half of that bar to do the restaurant that Pete and Ken and Harry go to, which is like a Jim Downey steakhouse or whatever. And on that note too, I noticed this on like the third time watching that there's that moment where Harry's like, oh, I want a Caesar salad but no dressing or whatever, but like. And so you're kind of like, okay, yeah, he's like maybe watching his weight or he's trying to be a little LA because he's been embracing that lifestyle. But earlier in the episode, you see him like eating a donut. So I think, Will, what I'm trying to tell you, and I think what Mike has been trying to tell you as well, Harry's just so two-faced. He's just like, he's not a good dude.
Oh, I mean, I'm not vouching for the guy. I just think it's funny that like you're always like, Harry, so bad. Ken, so good, and I guess maybe they'll come to pass during the second half of the show more. But
can I help? Can I help explain it? Will, I think if we could put it in a way to help you understand, is that Harry is so bad, and Ken is so good.
Oh, okay, I see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that simple, really. I think that's about everything I had for trivia and all that stuff. The only other thing I know I kind of touched on it earlier, but I think it's so impressive that the shot where Allison throws the thing, like it's like a little ball or whatever at the photographs, like the fact that that's in one take, especially because of the way that the photographs like fall, because so many things could have been messed up with that take, and they had like multiple photographs for her to use it on, but she like really practiced with it. And there's even the whole thing like if you hit the photographs in the wrong way, the reflection can mess everything up, because then like the flare from the light, or it can show a camera or something like that. But the fact that they got it like the first time and it's just right, I think it's pretty amazing.
It's cool. I believe that's an ashtray, by the way, like a fancy sort of ashtray.
You can believe whatever you want, Will Ashton, and I will never argue with you. I always assume what you're saying is 100% true. Always, forever.
Yeah, I doubt that, but thank you.
And that should do it for this week's episode of Men. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to talk about or touch on before we go ahead and start typing up our recommendations about each other?
I mean, I want to hear more about Mike's baby, but I don't know if he's willing to divulge it.
No, I legally, I can't. Vicks Chemicals, I got a strict NDA. It's pretty boilerplate.
Well, maybe next time, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a natal disclosure thing. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for. Yeah.
Will, are you excited for? So, do we talk about what the next episode is? The Ken Door pilot.
Oh yeah. It's like a spinoff. Like Ken Geyer, kind of just like trying to get that Pepsi account.
Oh, good. Okay.
What would that be like?
Oh boy, I hope that means more Mountain.
I hope
that means more. Yeah, more Mountain Dew. I can't wait.
I like how Will was like, I like this episode. There's Mountain Dew and nudity in it.
Yeah, there you go. What more do you need?
But I didn't like that they said the R word.
Oh boy. Okay, I don't know what the Forrest Gump impression was about, but fine.
Yeah, I don't know why I did that. Sorry.
I thought he was going for like Jimmy Stewart personally, but sure.
No, I think that was Forrest Gump, but
My mistake.
It wasn't anything. That was just a voice.
That was just
All right.
Mike being Mike. That's how he operates.
let's just leave it at that, I guess. I think that's a good place to end it.
We'll be back next time to talk about the chrysanthemum and the sword, which does sound like something Ken would write, which is going to be episode 5 of season 4. And I did see something funny on Reddit actually about what kind of writer Ken Cosgrove probably is like from that era. And I saw a lot of things that looked totally wrong. Like somebody compared like to Isaac Asimov, and I was like, stop. Like, no, give me a break. But okay. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll see you all again. Bye.